Recording in progress.
Okay, we'll try this again. Good evening. Thank you for everyone that's joining us tonight, both in person and virtually through Zoom. My name is Will Hager, and I'm a planner with the Department of Planning and Zoning that's been helping out with the zoning ordinance update. And to my right, we have Rachel O'Shea, zoning planner, along with additional planning and zoning staff who have been very gracious and volunteering tonight to help us out with any questions from the public. So for tonight, we'll begin with our presentation, followed by a question and answer period for those with us here and virtually. But to start things off, I just want to go over a brief timeline on where we are in the process and how we got here. So to begin, we had our draft zoning ordinance made available to the public in May. We had a joint work session and a public forum held in June on draft zoning districts and the zoning map. We had a public forum held in August on the draft critical area, marine and water dependent facilities, and floodplain articles, followed by work sessions in September and October. We had a public forum held in October on the draft zoning approvals, variances and appeals, nonconformities, and enforcement articles, followed by joint work sessions and a joint work session in November. And we had a public forum held in November on outdoor lighting, parking, and landscaping, followed by a joint work session yesterday evening. And since the beginning of this process, planning and zoning staff have met with a number of representatives from several organizations as well as individual citizens to discuss the proposed changes in the zoning update, and will continue meeting with groups and individuals throughout this process when requested. Question and comments from the public, both via email and from staff taking notes at the first public forum, were compiled and used to create an FAQ section on the zoning ordinance update website. And the zoning ordinance update website, which you can see a link to in this slide here, you go there to access links to draft articles, the draft zoning map, find out where to send public comment, and you'll find all other supplemental materials there as well. And so the focus of tonight's forum is going to be Article 25, Site Development and Design Standards. So Article 25 consists of site circulation standards for vehicles and pedestrians, design of residential subdivisions and development, on-site residential recreation requirements, design of non-residential development, residential development of previously recorded lots, requirements for age-restricted housing communities, design of manufacturing home communities, and planned unit developments. But before we get into these slides, I just want to mention that for those who are unaware, we've been putting together documents which compare the draft zoning ordinance with the current zoning ordinance. And for those who'd like to see how revised regulations compare directly with the current regulations, that document should be helpful. And that document is available on the zoning ordinance website. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get into that level of detail in this presentation, or we would be here all night. But moving forward, we'll begin with on-site pedestrian and bicycle circulation. And the first thing I'd like to point out is in the current zoning ordinance, the provisions of this section are located in separate residential and non-residential sections. And in the draft, these sections have been consolidated and combined. The provisions of this section in the draft apply to all residential and non-residential development unless otherwise specified. And so in the draft, the sidewalk requirement for residential subdivisions has been revised and now states, In single-family detached residential developments, sidewalks shall be required along both sides of any proposed public road and at least one side and preferably both sides of any proposed private road. Family conveyance access roads and residential developments in the Farm and Forest District and Rural Community District with fewer than 25 lots are exempt from this requirement. And some other highlights of this section include minimum width for sidewalks defined as 5 feet, and the minimum width for multi-use paths defined as 8 feet, except when adjacent to arterial or collector roads where it's 10 feet. Sidewalks or multi-use paths are required along the site frontage of existing or proposed public roads. Sidewalks or multi-use paths required to link residences with parking lots, recreation facilities, open space, parks, schools, institutional, and commercial developments and town centers. And sidewalks or multi-use paths, in addition to those adjacent to roads, the road, required to connect cul-de-sacs and dead-end roads to create a more complete pedestrian circulation system. This section also includes provisions for vehicular circulation, road design, drive-through facilities, and stacking. The provisions of these sections were reviewed and revised with contributions from the Department of Public Works, and provisions in the current zoning ordinance which address construction criteria for roads have been removed at the request of the Department of Public Works. And that, FYI, that's more to do with ensuring that our zoning ordinance doesn't conflict with Department of Public Works, their road and site development ordinance, than any policy changes necessarily. And in the next few slides, I'd like to highlight a few revisions added or revised related to site access. And the following provision has been added to the draft zoning ordinance. Residential developments that exceed 50 dwelling units and/or lots shall provide a minimum of 2 access points that can be accessed by all units and/or lots. Residential developments that exceed 150 dwelling units and/or lots shall provide a minimum of 3 access points that can be accessed by all units and/or lots, and the Planning Commission may waive this requirement due to environmental constraints. And I believe one of the primary reasons staff wanted to include this provision are emergency situations. If a resident of a community has a health emergency or there's a fire and it takes emergency vehicles extra time to reach their destination because of insufficient access, that could be the difference between life or death. So I think that's one of the primary reasons why that provision was included. And the following provision was included in the draft zoning ordinance. Where a future roadway is designated on an approved county map, site plans and/or subdivisions for development adjacent to the designated roadway shall provide a platted connection to the future roadway and transfer that area by deed to the Board of County Commissioners of Calvert County for future development. If the future roadway is located within the parcel, it shall be platted and transferred by deed to the Board of County Commissioners of Calvert County at the time of final plat recordation. And this replaces the following provision in the current zoning ordinance. Where a future roadway is designated on an approved county map, site plans for development adjacent to the designated roadway shall include provisions for future access to the roadway. And so this is an example of a regulation where the revision doesn't necessarily change the spirit or the goal of the regulation, but it includes details that add clarity, whereas the regulation as currently written is vague enough that there could be other interpretations on how it should be applied. And the following provision was included in the draft zoning ordinance. If the adjacent property is not fully developed, adequate access shall be provided by a reserved platted future right-of-way with temporary construction easements and amenities easements for future road extension. The right-of-way or public or private road construction shall extend to an adjacent property. Upon development of the adjacent property, the developer of that adjacent parcel shall be responsible for the building of the road connection. Temporary easements for turnarounds shall be provided at the boundary lines. So moving on to site design of residential developments, the focus of these slides is primarily going to be on open space. So to start off, we'll address clustering. Clustering or clustered subdivisions is a development design technique that concentrates lots in specific areas on a site to allow remaining land to be used for recreation, common open space, or the preservation of historically or environmentally sensitive features. In the draft zoning ordinance, the clustering of subdivisions is not required in the residential district and the rural neighborhood district. In the current zoning ordinance, clustering is also not required in the residential district or within the 1 mile radius or perimeter of town centers. And the rural neighborhood district has been introduced to replace the 1 mile radius policy from the town centers of Dunkirk, Owings, Huntingtown, and St. Leonard town centers. So the draft is consistent with the current policy in that way. And in the draft zoning ordinance, clustering of subdivisions is required in the farm and forest district and the rural community district with a few exceptions. But first, in the current zoning ordinance, in cases where all proposed lots are a minimum of 20 acres, clustering is not required in any zoning district. In the draft zoning ordinance, clustering is not required for new lots created that are at least 25 acres in size in the farm and forest district, and in cases where the parcel being subdivided is less than 30 acres, clustering is not required in any zoning district. And in the draft, the required open space and clustered subdivisions in the farm and forest district is 80%, which is basically consistent with the current policy. However, the open space requirement has been revised slightly for clustered subdivisions within the rural community district. In the draft zoning ordinance, at least 60% of the site must be designated open space, and lots and roads are to be clustered onto the remainder of the site in the rural community district. In the current zoning ordinance, clustering building lots and roads onto no more than 50% of the site is required in the RCD unless located within the 1 mile radius of a town center where clustering isn't required. And a provision that was added to the draft zoning ordinance that should be highlighted: for subdivisions with 25 or more lots, the draft zoning ordinance requires that a developer convey the open space on the final plat to the subdivision's incorporated homeowners association and ensure that the open space will be protected by legal arrangements sufficient to assure the maintenance and preservation for their intended purpose. Subdivisions with 25 or more lots is also the threshold where recreational amenities are required to be installed by the developer in the draft. So that's a primary reason why the number 25 was chosen as the threshold. For subdivisions with fewer than 25 lots, any parcel of open space which is not retained by the owner of record at the time of the subdivision may be sold or otherwise conveyed to any individual, organization, or governmental entity, provided the open space is conveyed in sections not less than 20 acres in size, unless the total sum of the open space is less than 20 acres, in which case the open space is required to be conveyed in whole. So moving on to on-site residential recreation requirements. In the draft zoning ordinance, one thing I wanted to mention before I get into the details. This section on residential recreation requirements was reviewed by the Department of Parks and Recreation, and recommendations from Parks and Rec were included in this draft. So in the draft zoning ordinance, single-family detached developments with 25 or more lots must provide neighborhood recreation on site, and land suitable for neighborhood recreation must be provided at a minimum of 950 square feet per lot in total. In the current zoning ordinance, subdivisions with 50 or more lots must provide neighborhood recreation on site, and a minimum of 800 square feet per dwelling unit must be provided for neighborhood recreation. And another thing I just want to mention, in the current zoning ordinance, these residential recreation requirements are located in separate articles and sections, and in the draft, like in other sections, these sections have been combined and consolidated into one section, but the provisions of this section apply to all residential development unless otherwise specified. So in terms of recreational green space, there's a certain amount of fields that are required to be provided, and there are minimum standards for those fields, such as 10,000 square feet per field, at least 100 feet by 100 feet, etc. In the draft zoning ordinance, the number of fields required for recreational green space is determined by multiplying the total number of lots or dwelling units by 400 square feet and dividing this total by 10,000 square feet. The total number of fields equals the whole number in the dividend. In the current zoning ordinance, this calculation begins by multiplying the total number of lots or units by 150 square feet. And just to clarify, that 400 square feet is part of the 950 square feet overall mentioned in the previous slide. So roughly 40% of the total square footage of recreation required at a minimum is provided in the form of green space, and the remaining square footage is to be applied to other recreational facilities. And I just want to mention a few other provisions relevant here. The following provision was added to the draft. Fields designated as recreational green space should generally be consolidated into one single area, but may be divided for more equitable distribution into two areas if the subdivision contains 50 or more residential lots. Another provision added, recreational green space shall be located on cleared land and level to a degree suitable enough for playing on the field. The grade should have a maximum 3% slope. And another provision added, if athletic fields such as baseball fields or soccer fields, etc., are proposed to meet the recreational green space requirements, development plans, including but not limited to field dimensions and field specifications, shall be approved by the director of the Department of Parks and Recreation or their designee. So in the current zoning ordinance, at minimum, recreational green space, hard surface courts, and mini parks for townhome or multifamily developments are required to be provided. The draft zoning ordinance allows a little bit more flexibility in terms of the types of recreation facilities that can be provided after a minimum amount of recreational green space. So if a developer wants to provide something like a community garden plots, fitness trails, or picnic pavilions instead of hard surface courts, they could do that. And in the draft, if playgrounds are provided, minimum standards have been added, and they would include things like minimum size requirement of 1,800 square feet, play structures for children of all ages, a prohibition on wood or wood products for play equipment, at least 2 benches and shade trees to be provided, and a minimum distance of 200 feet from residences. And there are no minimum standards for playgrounds in the current zoning ordinance. And just quickly, a few other provisions that have been added to this section. A provision added that clarifies that recreational green space cannot be located in the center of cul-de-sacs or traffic circles. We added a provision requiring benches and shade trees to be installed for recreational green space in certain recreational facilities. A provision added requiring hard surface multi-use paths as an interconnected system linking residential uses with recreational facilities, parks, and the various categories of open space. And added provisions requiring residential developments 100 or more lots or dwelling units to provide a minimum of 10 square feet of indoor community space per lot or dwelling unit. And a section addressing planned unit developments, or PUDs, was added to the draft zoning ordinance. A planned unit development is a mixed-use development that must combine residential with a combination of recreational, commercial, or institutional elements. The goal of a PUD is to achieve a substantially higher quality development that provides a public benefit that would otherwise not be obtained. A PUD proposal requires Board of County Commissioner approval. Plan unit developments encourage mixed development patterns to avoid monotony, provide relief from the strict application of land use standards, development regulations, and performance standards found in the base zoning districts, allow a developer to take advantage of special sites, characteristics, locations, or land uses, and any use included in this ordinance and any town center zoning ordinance may be applicable to the land subject to the PUD, may be included in a PUD plan, provided that the use and the density or intensity of the use is consistent with the comprehensive plan's land use concept for the area and the provisions of the zoning ordinance. And so I think that the key here is that a PUD can allow more flexibility in terms of the strict applications of the zoning regulations, but it needs to be mixed use and offer some kind of public benefit that wouldn't otherwise be obtained, like maybe a library or community center, et cetera, while still being consistent with the comprehensive plan. And we'll wrap things up with archaeological and historic significance. In the current zoning ordinance, the provisions protecting structures and sites with historic significance for residential subdivisions and townhomes multifamily development are located in separate sections and are worded and are substantively different. In the draft, these provisions have been consolidated and are located in one section. And in the current zoning ordinance, the provisions protecting structures and sites with historic significance apply only to residential development. In the draft zoning ordinance, these provisions apply to residential development as well as all development requiring site plan approval. And provisions have been added addressing pre-existing cemeteries and development occurring along a designated historic roadway in order to preserve the historic character of the landscape as viewed from the road. So, in summary, we have revisions to on-site pedestrian circulation requirements. Provisions in the current zoning ordinance which address construction criteria for roads have been removed. Revisions to site access requirements. Revisions to some clustering and open space provisions. Subdivisions of 25 or more lots required to convey open space to a homeowners association. Revisions to requirements for on-site residential recreation. Inclusion of a plan unit development section. And revisions to archaeological and historic significance provisions. So I believe we're ready for public comment. If there's anyone in the audience who has any questions that they'd like to share, they're welcome to step up to the microphone.
So I'm Bob Estes, and I'm representing myself. By the way, I was amused that they can't have recreational activities inside of traffic circles. I think that was, sorry, but that was kind of amusing. But I'm glad it's there, but it caught me that way.
Well, it's there for a reason.
Oh, I'm sure that it is, but I can just see parents telling them to go play in the traffic circle. But anyway, so in the, I call it the presentations on Flood Night on Tuesday, they talked about local rainfall modeling and that sort of thing, and they talked about using the NOAA data, which I've used myself as well, that actually does include local. You have to kind of tease it out because you have to know, like Coco Ra's names for places, but there's definitely some local places in there, and that's good. My question sort of is maybe an open one, is how long do we have to wait until stormwater management picks up on that lead and starts using that data? You probably don't have the answer, but if you did, it might be a question you might want to ask them yourselves, because it really makes a big difference if you build stuff a little more robustly when it comes time to fix and maintain, and could actually save the county money in the long run. Not to mention the what helps the bay and the river, which we all seem to agree we want to protect. So that's a comment. You've heard similar comments before, but I was surprised to see that they're actually using it for that. Okay, so I'm a hardhead when it comes to clustering. I still have to say that I don't entirely understand it. I mean, I know what it is and I know what it's for, but when I read this particular section, it seemed like there were a lot of caveats, and I'm wondering if you could maybe kind of walk me through a little bit on what is done as opposed to all the caveats to say what isn't, where it isn't done, just for my education. I promise I won't ever ask again if you do a good job. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm not sure if there's someone in the audience tonight that might be able to go into the caveats a little bit better than I could, but I think the idea is to preserve a minimum amount of the site, and depending on the district, it's going to be more or less. In the Farm and Forest District, obviously, that's going to be the most preserved. And then once you've identified the areas that are going to be preserved, and a lot of those areas are going to be the more environmentally sensitive areas, your steep slopes, your wetlands, your stream valleys, etc. But there are also different categories of open space, and those are designated on the plan during the approval process. And so, say there's a portion of the property in the Farm and Forest District, for instance, that is still farmable. You can designate that as a farm reserve, and then there's certain activities and structures that would be permitted in that section of the open space as compared to other sections of the open space that have a different designation. So yeah, you're starting off, there's a certain minimum amount of area that's going to have to be preserved, and then you break it down into, what is the defining characteristic of, that particular area of open space, and then the activities that and structures that could be permitted in those designated areas are going to depend on those designations. Is there anyone else in the audience that might want to add? Or correct me if I got anything wrong?
No. Carolyn Sunderland, Deputy Director of Planning. The advantage of clustering is that you can preserve more sensitive environmental features or prime farmland, and the developer, by reducing the lot size. So that's the advantage. You can go from, a conventional lot size of 3 acres down to 1 acre, and get more density, get the same density that you would be. Yes, and I will use College Station because it did have a lot of wetlands that had to be preserved. So the benefit is the developer can reduce the lot size and hopefully get the same number of lots he would be permitted before, but preserve and provide more open space, more green space for the residents and environmental protection. So that's still a tough thing to do because, of course, the places that they want to develop are the places that it's most easy, the open field. And so there's a bit of a conflict there, but the open space is classified in several different areas. For instance, what Will was saying about the agricultural, that's generally the more flexible open space. It's generally suited to be held in private ownership or retained by the original owner so that he can continue to farm and produce an income and keep that farm going and still derive some benefit from his development rights. Whereas there is forest conservation, there is just plain conservation, forest retention, forest conservation, and then plain conservation for steep slopes, wetlands, floodplain. So you have to qualify, your open space has to qualify for one of those designations. And I believe what's going to happen with the new ordinance is a certain amount has to be usable for active recreation depending on the size of your subdivision. So it cannot all be wetland and then you build on the rest. There has to be a balance.
Can I add?
Sure.
I'll come up here so we can.
And Bob, did I answer your question? Because I really wasn't sure what,
Yeah,
where we were going with it.
You had the slide up where the caveats actually were, but yeah, you got partway there for sure.
Okay.
I'm not even sure how to ask the question appropriately, to be honest with you.
Well, I just want to make sure that you get the information you want.
Yeah, thanks.
There's another benefit, so like, I think Carolyn did a good job of discussing it from like the developer side, but also when you're clustering to preserve environmental features, like especially you're doing it in a way so that those environmental features, so you're not having wetlands or buffers or streams or their buffers on the back of somebody's lot. And so when that person purchases that lot, that whole lot, they can put a pool in, they can put a swing set in, a trampoline in, and things like that. So their entire lot becomes usable. Whereas if you didn't cluster, you're gonna have buffers and things like that on the backs of people's lots. And then later on, those people are gonna not be able to use that portion of their yard, not be able to do anything on those steep slopes or anything like that. And so it actually allows homeowners, like, yes, you have a smaller lot, but it's an entirely usable lot instead of having 3 acres, but half of it isn't a buffer and you can't touch it anyway. So you get a little bit, and I'm Colleen England and I am an environmental planner, sorry. So you get a little bit, in case you couldn't tell, it's my example. So you get a little bit more utility like as a homeowner, and then everything is preserved in an open space as one big piece, and you're not worried about somebody trying to get a variance to touch things kind of piecemeal. It's all preserved as one contiguous piece of wetlands.
Larger developments that this applies to? I mean, I saw a lot of caveats on.
Well, there's changes, and I think Will can go back over them, and I wanted Will to confirm that.
You need to go to the microphone.
Oh,
so
sorry.
people on-
Trying to bring Zoom back.
Probably some people on the line.
Will can confirm it, but I do believe that the revised ordinance requires that no sensitive environmental features can be placed on the lots themselves. So that is a change. And
Yeah, so the specific regulation is no, what we're calling the natural resource protection areas, which encompass those sensitive environmental areas, plus their buffers, which we're proposing to also expand that buffer area compared to what it is currently. Those are not, they're proposed to not be allowed on lots less than 1 acre in size. If the lot is larger than 1 acre, then they would have to prove, it would have to be proven that it's still a buildable lot with, in terms of the primary dwelling and any amenities. But also, not only is the buffer area not permitted on those lots that are 1 acre or less, also the setback to the buffer area would not be permitted as proposed.
And I believe same thing with forest retention.
Right.
Correct me if I'm wrong. So all of your forest conservation requirements would be not affecting somebody's backyard. And so, like I said, everything is just gets to be one big piece in open space or two big pieces in separate open spaces, however it comes out. But you're, like she was saying, you get similar density, slightly smaller lots, and then everything that we're worried about protecting gets protected. Does that help?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
so. I think so. I probably should read it a few more times, but
It's-
this just pushed me down the road.
It,
It sounds great, really.
it is, it's a long, we've used the clustering as a planning tool for a number of years in a current ordinance. We're expanding it in the draft, and depending on the district, you know, in, for example, farm and forest, where we want more of our landscape preserved, we've got a higher standard for the amount of clustering that we want. So we want to condense where our lots are, so we have bigger, larger tracts of land that's intact. And as we go to different districts where the density is higher, and we have more residential as opposed to our farm and forest land, that standard for the amount of clustering goes down for those districts. So that's how we have it laid out in the draft.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thank you all, I should say.
Well, if,
Want to ask if there's anybody?
yeah, if there aren't any other questions here in person, do we have any questions from any viewers that are with us virtually?
Do any of the virtual attendees wish to speak? If so, please raise your virtual hands, and I'll call on you so that the people in the audience can also hear you. No hands are seen at this time.
Thank you, Chris.
You're welcome.
Well, if there's no other comments or no other questions, I think we'll move on to our wrap-up slide.
Yes, why not? So, just to quickly wrap this up, we do have a public comment period that's open for Article 25. Looks like about 2 weeks left on that. It closes December 29th, and our next public forum is scheduled for January 25th. And members of the public can submit comments to the email address that you see on the slide here, and you'll also see the contact information for Rachel and myself if you have any questions. And I believe we can wrap this up.
Thank you all.
Yep, thank you to everyone that's with us virtually as well.